welcome with me Amaka Okoye, West African Correspondent, Deutsche Welle News. Let's put our hands together for her as she comes up. She's my colleague, our colleague, so let's celebrate her. Also on this panel, first speaker, Shaffi Nuhu, Managing Editor, HumAngle. Let's put our hands together for Hawa as she comes on stage. Next up is Ndubuisi Nwokolo, Partner, Peace and Security, Nextier. Let's put our hands together for Ndubuisi Nwokolo as he comes up. And next up, I'm thinking Mr. Nwokolo will join us virtually. And next up is Chris Ngwodo, Director General, Office for Strategic Preparedness and Resilience, also on this plenary. Let's put our hands together for him. Next up is Executive Secretary, ADISI-Cameroon, Paul Joel Kamtchang. Mr. Paul Joel Kamtchang is coming up. Let's put our hands together for him. Don't you just love the hairstyle? We don't call it dreads, by the way. It's called locks. You know that, right? So when you see a hairstyle like this, don't call it dreads. Dreads is not something good. We call it locks. Last but not least on this panel is Saratu Joshua Pindar, Lead Center for Civilians in Conflict. Let's put our hands together for her as she comes up. So I want to do this just before we begin the plenary. We've been sitting for quite some time. So we'll take 2 minutes, right? So I'd like us to please rise to our feet. I just want us to stretch a little bit. How do you feel? It feels great, right? Thank you. You're welcome. So just do a stretch this way. And that's tough. Okay, Mr. Okoye, you can just do like this. So just stretch and breathe. Take it in. Then hold it, hold it, hold it. Then out. Slowly. One more time. In. Hold it. Then out. How do you feel? So pay me. I'm your new gym instructor. I charge in Naira and dollars. Thank you very much. Amaka, over to you.
Thank you very much,
So you have 40 minutes.
All right, thank you. I've noted that. It's a great thing that you started with the exercise, because the conversation we want to have is not the very sweet, nice one. It's about countering insurgency. And I look through the room and I see people who I know are very great at this and understand subject matter and context as well. And so that's why I'm very privileged to have this great panelists with me to begin this conversation. Of course, we also have someone who is joining us virtually, and I reckon he will be there at some point, Dr. Ndubuisi Nwokolo. So why are we having this conversation? I mean, just some time we were listening to other things, local government, we're talking about health, and then suddenly we are talking about security and countering insurgency. For those of you who know, my background is conflict correspondence and conflict reporting. And that's why we are having this conversation, because it is something that affects us. And we want to look at what is the media doing and how will the media continue to amplify, the voices of the people, provide solutions. Because one of the most important things about this conference is that it's looking for solutions. It's not just one of those conferences that you have for the sake. And I'm really incredibly proud of CJID, because at the end of the day, we want to know what are the practical solutions. Why is this ongoing? Why has it not stopped? Will it stop? What is the government doing? What are you doing? And what am I committed to do? And so we'll begin this conversation right now with Hawa, who is over there. For some reason, it seems like you're very far away. Is there an extra seat there? Do you want to take? Sorry?
Yeah, I think she's fine.
Yeah? Okay. So we will begin with you, Hawa, because you have rich experience in terms of covering conflict. Also, when we talk about context, one of the problems or challenges we have is the right reporting of conflict, putting it into context for people, and what is the perception that the media gives there. And for you, because you have been involved in rescue mission, you are in Borno doing incredible work as always, and also as editor. You make very serious decisions in terms of coverage and representation. And so, I mean, we will come to a lot of things, especially that talks directly to people. Because when we talk about, I think one of the things that we heard earlier is not reducing casualties or the human plight or the suffering or what insurgency and active extremism is causing to people, to statistics and numbers. And that's what most of your work have done. And I'm incredibly proud of you as well. And I'm glad that you got into that because you're very deserving of that. So I started with you because I want us to give this a phase before we come to the rest of the panelists. And because we're talking about talking to people, the room full of journalists, to ask how and what is the right way. And for you, I'll ask you, how can journalists, we begin from there, ensure accurate and ethical coverage of insurgency without jeopardizing national security? Because many times journalists have been accused of amplifying the voices of the enemy, quote unquote, and that's always a dilemma. So what do you do? How do we set the pace? We begin from there.
Thank you so much for such a robust introduction. I think that question is an excellent way to open this conversation. I'm not sure that there is one ethical way, but I will speak to some ways that have worked for us at HumAngle and hope that other people might find them useful. And the simplest way is to focus on the victims of the insurgency. Oftentimes, we are forced to confront statistics, huge numbers of people who have either been killed or displaced by the Boko Haram insurgency in the northeast or in the Lake Chad region. And some of these numbers say that there are up to 3 million people that have been displaced, and over 300,000 people have died as a result of the insurgency, either directly or indirectly. And so as we confront these numbers, it's very easy for us to desensitize, to not understand the magnitude of the problem. So one way that has worked for us is to ensure to look behind the people who constitute those numbers. Who are those victims? What is their name? What are their stories? Who are the people who have survived them? Their family members, their friends, their relatives. And so one way that has worked is for us to seek out family members of people who have died or people who have been displaced by the insurgency in this region, and communicating their stories in the most visceral and palpable way possible. When these things are done, it goes without saying that questions will arise in the minds of stakeholders, in the minds of ordinary audiences as to what kind of institutional failures enable that kind of brutality to exist. So if you're speaking, for example, about sex for food in IDP camps in Borno State, as you confront the realities of women and girls who have to go through these things, as you present their stories in the rawest possible form to members of the audience and even to stakeholders, and as they grapple with the reality of it, they will inevitably ask questions as to what kind of things or what kind of systems or people make that kind of dysfunction possible. And so what that kind of coverage does is ensure that, one, people have a right to know, and that they exercise that right by engaging with these stories, and that they ask the important questions, the questions that matter, towards unraveling the kinds of people who perpetuate these things, and then subsequently move towards getting accountability for people like that who are, responsible for these things. So the simple hack is to focus on the victims themselves, to bring their stories forward. Of course, as you do reportage like this, it's almost impossible to not sometimes feature the role that the perpetrator has played in that aspect, because part of journalism is also to lay out a chain of accountability. It's not just enough to say this thing has happened. We also have to say, why did it happen? What made it possible for it to happen? Who is responsible for it happening? An example would be the breakdown of the Alau Dam that caused the devastating Maiduguri floods a couple of months ago. It was incredibly devastating. thousands, hundreds of thousands of people were displaced. And as we grappled with the reality of that, it became important for us to also ask questions as to why did it happen? Was it truly a natural disaster, or did it happen because some people in some places did not do their jobs? And as we asked those questions, it was inevitable that we would uncover institutional failures. For example, people who were awarded contracts to do the reconstruction work around the dam and who did not do it, which then led to the breakdown of the dam. And so even as we confront stories about victims, about the human cost of conflicts, insurgency, and all of these disasters, it would also lead us to interrogate and amplify the role that people, whether they be terrorists or even state forces, have played in enabling these things.
Thank you so very much. This is why, I mean, yes, you can of course applaud her, because when people speak their lived experience, we know the difference. So it's not just about talking what you read, but it's what you have experienced, the issues that you interrogate on a daily basis, and we thank you for sharing that very powerfully here. And so because we're talking about nation building, we're also talking about resilience, we're also talking about why is this conflict not stopping? What should we do? I would ask you, Chris, because strategic preparedness and resilience is your bread and butter. And and your organization also is into that, what's the approach to conflict prevention and peace building in Northeast? And what successes have you recorded so far? I'm not sure we have all the time to speak to that, but you can give us practical ways. What have you done? Because at the end of the day, we want to know what we can do at our level, what we expect the government to do, and what the people who are affected need to do to make a positive difference. Chris.
Thank you very much. I think first the caveat I'll enter is that this agency was created in 2022.
So is it me or that we can't hear you?
Okay. Is this fine? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
All right. So the agency was created in 2022. So it's a young agency. My experience in the Northeast predates my assignment in this role. But our approach to peace building and conflict prevention is one that brings together three strands: security, peace, and development. What we believe is that it's not really possible to achieve sustainable peace without addressing the material conditions of the people. So that means what kind of economy exists in those localities, what kind of opportunities for self-actualization do the people have, what is the state of their livelihoods, for example. So our approach is quite holistic. More specifically, what we've done in recent years has been to support the efforts of the federal government and the state government in the area of disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, particularly. Durable solutions, which is the tag for, or the label, the name, what describes the kind of programming that the states, Borno, Adamawa, and Yobe specifically, have engaged in, is an effort to move beyond humanitarian interventions alone and go into building much more durable structures for sustainable peace. So we're addressing the broad spectrum of things. You asked
when you
why,
say durable structure for sustainable peace, what do you mean exactly?
So durable structures for sustainable peace speak to the fundamentals that I mentioned. If you have a community, what kind of livelihoods exist there? What is the economic capacity of that community? Can the people have any kind of gainful existence within that place? The idea is this, that it's not simply about the absence of violence, right? And physical violence is just one manifestation of violence. We're also interested in structural violence.
That's right.
So structural violence speaks to what informs the material conditions of those places. So now our work is to go beyond the cessation of violence, which has happened in a number of areas. But now you have this challenge of resettling people, of rebuilding livelihoods, of securing access to markets for them, of building infrastructure that was bombed out and destroyed during the insurgency. Resettled people need schools, they need clinics, they need court systems, the restoration of civil authority to those areas to make them viable habitations for people that is the broad spectrum of things that we're involved in. I know you ask what successes have been recorded so far. Frankly, it's too early to talk about that. This is something that happens over the medium to the long term. The insurgency has gone on for about 15 years now.
And has continued.
And it's ongoing. Although I must stress that many parts of the areas that were previously conflict affected are now largely in a post-conflict phase. The heaviest footprint of the fighting have moved further up towards northern Borno and the Lake Chad area specifically. It does not mean that you do not have crime, for example. So you will have to deal with things like that, and we have to build the structures from the ground up to deal with those things. If you're relocating people, so a very practical, real-life incident that we come across often is IEDs, unexploded ordnance that have been left, their communities littered with this stuff. So part of the idea or part of the program for restoring civil authority to those places is to demine those areas. From time to time, you have situations where a population might return to a given community, and one day somebody goes into his farm and then steps on an IED and then gets blown up. So now you have to do things like demining huge areas. You asked why, I think the last question I'll take on, because you asked like a triple loader, why the insurgency is still on. I think you asked that. First of all, insurgencies the world over take a long time to defeat. And typically, they are not defeated militarily. In the last 50 years, there's only been one example of a country that defeated an insurgency militarily, and that was Sri Lanka with the Tamil Tigers. But Sri Lanka is a very unique geographical context. It's an island, and they were able to use a scorched earth approach to end that insurgency. For us as a government, what we've decided and what we've resolved, what we recognize is that we cannot use a scorched earth approach in dealing with this insurgency. That is one. The second is that Borno itself, if you take just Borno alone, Borno is larger than the entire southeast put together. You're dealing with a significant land mass. And while a lot of places have been sufficiently pacified for us to think about post-conflict rebuilding, you still have this large expanse of land that you need to bring under subjection, as it were. That will take time. So these are practical problems that will be solved practically, and they are not short-term problems either. The things that triggered the insurgency did not happen overnight. So obviously, rebuilding will also not happen overnight.
That's right. Thank you so very much, Chris. So just so this conversation is not flying over our heads, I'd also like to bring you, Paul, to share your own experiences in terms of, coming very close to these insurgency that has continued. We said it started and is still continuing. Like Chris did say, we're not expecting that it will be over just by blink of eye. But what are your experiences and what are the patterns that you have seen, over time, seen in your own experience, and you can identify it when you place it in other, regions in the Sahel, for instance?
Okay, thank you. I will first of all, on this stage, thank CGID, with who we have been working on this project around the Lake Chad since 3 years now, with journalists from Chad and also from Cameroon, and other journalists or other CSO involved in this conflict around the Lake Chad, especially in the far north of Cameroon and also in the east of Chad. So I would like to talk about this issue on the information perspective, saying that since we started this project, I was wondering why the world don't know much about what is happening around the Lake Chad, because there's not too much information around this conflict issue on the perspective of the lack of the arms groups, and also even of Boko Haram too. You know, you have many groups, armed groups there involved in this conflict, but you also have Boko Haram. And if you remember, weeks ago, Chad said that he's not longer involved in this conflict with other states around the Lake Chad, like Niger, Nigeria, Cameroon, and Chad, because he noticed that other countries are not well involved or well engaged to fight against what is happening around there. So what we notice is that there is not too much information to better understand what is going around this conflict around the Lake Chad. You know, what the previous people say is on the perspective of the academic approach, or also the perspective of the journalism approach. But we have deployed journalists on the ground to go and investigate, to discuss with communities affected by this conflict, and also with some people who are not longer there. You know, we have this Boko Haram issue, but we also have the fact that there is not too much water to people to be alive and to continue with their activity like fishing and other poaching and other. So we do think that is very important to see how many journalists or media organizations should be involved to work around this issue, because you cannot access information. It's only research information you can access, but accessing the area is very difficult because as journalists, you can be kidnapped. And so many journalists are very afraid to go there and collect information, discuss with community, and so on. So we do think that it's very important to see how we can bring stakeholders around the same table and to discuss the way to bring people to be very aware about what is happening there. You know, years ago, the states around the Lake Chad are discussing how they can bring water from Congo Basin to Lake Chad, and it costs a lot. So no one is longer involved in this project because no one don't want to put fund to bring this water and so on. And the conflict is still continues because, you know, lack of water, lack of market, there is not fish, there is not also cows and so on. So it's very important to see how we can address the issue on the perspective of information, the perspective of CSO also, because, you know, there are many, what we notice is that there are many human violations right there because people are not accessing information, they cannot discussing with local communities. So we do think that this should be a synergy work, bringing around stakeholders like government, like CSO, and also journalists to see how we can address this issue.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul. Because the issue in the Lake Chad Basin, they are really diverse. We're talking about the climate issue there that is even aggravating the sufferings of the people. And then the active, you know, violent extremism that is going on, Boko Haram and other militia group that is there. And so that's what you said is really true, that journalists, you know, are not able to access information. You're not, first of all, you're not able to access the place. Even when you get in there, you're not sure whether you're coming out. And these are really daily issues that journalists who are able to go there
and
experience.
When you access some local community, it's a bit difficult to say something because they are very afraid. You know, saying what is happening there, they are afraid that journalists are going to spread it, and sometimes they are going to be in threat with Boko Haram or also with local government who are protecting a lot of illicit traffic there on the ground.
Yeah, thank you very much. I suppose that one of the things that we are doing, what we hope that this conference will do, is bring in that solution. And that's why really CJID, I must say that you're 10 years old, but indeed, like they said, you're behaving like people who are already 50. Because it is capital intensive even to have media organizations have their journalists or their media personnel to go cover such things. Maybe the conversation will be partnerships at this time, and to broker this sort of engagement. So we see, because For instance, I'm a journalist, but I honestly don't want to die in war or in any conflict, to be very honest, you know. I pray every day that I die a natural death. Let it not be related to the work I do. So if we have this sort of partnership, then we'll be able to have this conversation and have funding allocated to this, because information is power. For those, I mean, I know that, what's her name? Hawa, I was going to call you another name. I know that Hawa, you would know for sure that when you go to these places, these people who are in conflict region are eternally grateful to you. Because if you don't go there, the world may never see or hear what is happening. And you always deal with the guilt of having to go and knowing that you don't know if you find these people alive next time. You just hop on the plane or whatever, and there you go. And you continue to deal with that guilt. So it's true that, you know, covering conflict, reporting conflict is capital intensive, and we need a lot of partnership. We need people to put money in media, actually, to put money in media organizations to say this is dedicated to covering this conflict and breaking it down so that people understand. Because at the end of the day, it is human life, and that's why we must give conflict human face. I recognize that we have Dr. Ndubuisi Nwokolo here, I reckon, and you are just back also from another conference, and we're really grateful to you to have the time to join us to have this conversation on the Lake Chad Basin and, you know, the Sahel region generally, and to find solutions. You know, what can we do? Over time, we have this conversation. Over time, insurgency is continuing. It's spreading even far. They are also devising new means and ways. You know, they're always a step ahead. What is the secret that we do not have, you know, even as state or non-state actors or private individuals or security agencies? What is the secret that we do not have that makes these people, bad guys, quote unquote, to be one step ahead? And what is it we need to crack to be able to say, well, we know that we can't rid the world of insurgency, the Lake Chad Basin, but we can significantly reduce the sufferings of the people in practical ways? Dr. Nwokolo.
Thank you so much. Thank you to CJID for inviting me. I think there are a couple of things. First, I think our approach to understanding the entire dynamics and complexities in the region, I think that we need to understand. Sometimes you find out that when we are trying to describe, for instance, the drivers from what I call a silo perspective, without thinking that, see, each driver has a trans-dimensional perspective and a multi-dimensional approach. So when you're, for instance, when you're looking at climate change, you're looking at climate change and economic issues as how does this affect issues of, say, livelihood? So the ability to intertwine all this together becomes one secret that we have over the years overlooked, and it continues to affect the entire dynamic. So in the Lake Chad region, it's important for us to equally understand that today, the state as an institution no longer possess that violence, that monopoly of violence that we used to know. So for instance, if those of us who understand political philosophy will always talk about John Locke and
I'm afraid we can't.
the Hobbes contract and all that. And once the state, can you hear me?
Yeah, Dr. Nwokolo, there seems to be a glitch, but yes, we can hear you now. You may continue.
Okay, so I was talking about that the inability of the state to continue to represent itself as that monopoly of violence is one thing that we have lacked over the years. So we need to understand that the state is, and that's why armed group or non-state security provisional groups
I really apologize for the quality of the audio there, Dr. Nwokolo. We will come back to you. We just might need to rectify the quality of the audio from our end here. If you can hear me, I apologize profusely. While we wait for this to be sorted out, I'm sure our people are on it. I'd like to speak to you, Saratu. I mean, you work with the victims in conflict. It means that you meet them in their raw state. They get to you first before they get to the rest of the world. And so there are different layers that come to you that you handle before the rest of us will be aware of it. But you know, when we talk about insurgency, there is no how we will not talk about security forces. And most of the time, you know, in our own context, we're talking about military. And we know a lot go on in there, which we don't know whether we have. We can talk about them openly here, but let's stick to what we can talk about openly here, especially because we're looking for solutions. One of the questions that we have for you is, how can human rights frameworks guide military and security interventions to minimize civilian harms? And it would be lovely if you give us some examples, because I know you have tons of them.
Thank you very much. Human rights framework are very key, especially when you look at conflicts and how it affects civilians. Having human rights framework embedded into military operations is very key because it provides the essential guidelines and the principles for them to operate. For instance, where this comes to play is when you have a framework, it then guides them on how they develop their rules of engagement. So it gives clear rules of engagement. For instance, how do you distinguish between a civilian objective and a military objective? And in plain language, meaning, how do I say this building is of military interest? One of the things is if there are active combatants housed in this place and they're using it, for instance, as their base. And then in comparison to maybe a hospital where, for instance, an insurgent in trying to escape runs through the hospital and gains an access to another place. So it's for the military to understand how do we distinguish. Then it also helps them understand the use of proportionality. And it's like, what weapon do I use? For instance, you'd agree with me that the wars we're fighting are non-conventional warfare. And wars are being fought in densely populated areas where civilians are. We try to help the military understand with those policies, how then do you put the civilian at the center of your operation? Do you then use, say for instance, a pistol to take out one insurgent, or do you then launch a rocket, propelled grenade or something, looking at what is the extent of damage that does, in contrast to you achieving your military objective. So those human rights framework helps them understand how to apply this and how then do they put it on ground. How does the soldier on ground then bring this to the operation?
Because I want to ask you, Saratu, how much of knowledge do they have, our military? Because, I was in Chibok, and I slept in Chibok for days. And one of the things that I found was how very militarized Chibok is, and how it is really almost difficult to give some respect to civilians, to what matters to them, if they ever have any rights left of them. For instance, the school in Chibok that was bombed, of course, journalists you don't get access to it. Yeah. But we know that it's no more the school, it's now the base, it's now a military base. And these people have come so close to violence that they are almost stripped of whatever rights and privileges that is left. How much of knowledge or information, or how do you even crack the military personnel? How do you tell them, how do you give them this information to recognize that they are dealing with people, though they are in conflict regions and they've been affected, that they still have some human dignity and rights that needs to be respected? We are talking of men, military men, who are standing in the sun, who, every other things that we may not say. So how do you convince them? How do you say it to them? I'd like to know.
So one of the things we identified when we joined the humanitarian community in Borno State in 2017 was to carry out a research to help us understand what are the dynamics that fuel civilian harm as a result of some of the counterinsurgency operations happening in the Northeast. And what we realized is the fact that aside from the training the military receives within the training institutions and then at the point of deployment, once you're deployed out there, you don't get to have like consistent reminders in form of training to help you checkmate yourself. And in one of the high-level dialogues we had in 2018 with the Defense Headquarters, it was clear that there was an issue of capacity. And then, of course, we then went on to work with the Nigerian Defense Defense Headquarters to look at how then do we bring this knowledge to the soldier who is manning, say, the perimeter in the community. We have targeted the training centers. We've worked with the Martin Luther Agwai Training Center. We've also trained soldiers within the Armed Force and Command Staff College in Jaji. We have engaged with the Theater Training School in Maiduguri and a couple of training centers. And what we normally would do is we understand that they've had trainings. When you look at the way the military is, they have their doctrines. And then, of course, oftentimes organizations like us would come in to say, you need to also, in addition to your doctrine, make sure that you're observing what the international laws are saying to protect civilians who are not party to the conflict. And the difficulty or the disconnect we've identified is the fact that when you place the two, it is a natural, I don't want to say it's a natural instinct, but it just comes to them. They would pick the doctrine first, and then the human right parts kind of comes afterwards. And when we identified this with the training institutions, the military training institutions, what we decided to do was to design our trainings to bring it down to that level where they can practically see it. For instance, when you're doing your weapon training for your cadets or your officers, how do you incorporate the human aspect of it? So what we try to do is help them understand that, for instance, looking at the kind of warfare we're fighting, integrate civilian silhouettes in those scenarios. And then it helps the soldier begin to think, oh, there is a civilian within this. What do I do? What decisions do I take? And so those are some of the trainings we've done for them. Mm-hmm. We've also gone as far as training them on how do you engage with the community. Because one of the challenges we saw also in the Northeast was at the beginning of the insurgency, there was very little engagement with the community. And that really destroyed the fabric of trust between the civilians and the military. The military felt the civilians were not cooperating with them, they were not giving them information. And then the civilians were also feeling that the military is here to kill us. Mm-hmm. Because there have been instances where misconception, misunderstanding has led to civilian harm, huge civilian harm. And I'm really happy to say that looking back in retrospect, we're beginning to see the military really rising up to the occasion. The current Chief of Defense Staff has put it out there that his goal is to engage more of non-kinetic approach to the warfare than the kinetic approach, because we see that it's not making any sense. An example I would give you is when we established some of our dialect platforms to help the military and the civilians connect in a community called Konduga, in an LGA called Konduga, anytime there's an attack, the military is always delayed in coming to respond, especially during rainy season. Mm-hmm. And for the military, they didn't understand the terrain, whereas the community understood what the problem was. Insurgents will come in on light motorbikes, and they go in, create havoc, and they're out before the military then brings their heavy machineries and their big cars. But then, of course, they can't make it through. And in one of the conversations where the civilians were really voicing out to say, you really want these people to kill us, because anytime we call, you've given us your number, the CO's number and every other person, but we call and then you're very slow to respond. They then open up to say, okay, anytime we're coming in, we find it difficult to move our vehicles because the terrain is muddy, is sticky, so this is a challenge for us. And the civilians then offers that simple solution. Okay, why don't you use lighter vehicles to travel? And the military did listen. And that kind of helps with them then coming in quickly in time to respond to civilians. That's just one of the examples of when you create platforms for the military and civilians to engage, it is very important, And those are some of the examples that we've had.
Yeah, thank you very much. Because at the end of the day, the people understand what is going on. They know the terrain. They know where these people are. I'll tell you very quickly. One time we were covering one of these places, and our fixer, who's a local, said to us, we got to this part, and he said, from this side to this side is where the Boko Haram are. From this other side to the other side is where ordinary people are. So they know, which means that the government also know. If these people know, our government, somehow we know, maybe just what is lacking at some point is the political will. And that will bring me to you, Hawa. I see again that Dr. Nwokolo is there, but I'll bring him in very quickly. Hawa, I really want to understand. Let's talk about perception. Sometimes the media also, we do have the responsibility to report correctly, but sometimes we go, it's more sensationalism. How do you balance that? Because you want the world to know, but you also want to tell the story as accurately as possible within the ethics of our practice as journalists. And how do you pass on these, to your people as an editor? Because at the end of the day, you don't want to exploit the sufferings of the people just because you want to be seen as being the first to break the news or for whatever reasons.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. Before I answer that, I will just say something very quickly.
We can hear you.
To some of the points raised by the previous speaker.
I'm afraid we can't hear you.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you need to bring it up a bit.
Is this better?
Yes, please.
Okay. Right. So before I answer that question, I just want to say something very quickly in response to some of the points that were raised by the previous speaker, especially as regards counterinsurgency operations and how they can sometimes affect civilian populations. I think it's a tactic of war everywhere in the world that non-state actors would use civilians as human shields, especially when they are in some of these their bases, so that when military airstrikes want to happen or operations, the state armies would have to think twice before invading those places and stuff like that. But we have seen instances where military airstrikes have targeted wholly civilian populations. We have seen that in Niger State, we have seen that in Nasarawa, we have seen that in places like Mongono in Borno State. So it's understandable if a lot of these civilian places are infiltrated by terrorists. But there have been cases where they are entirely civilian populations. Even children have been victims of airstrikes in places like Kuregbe in Niger State. And we have had instances where the military would take responsibility, but there is very little, if any, sort of intervention or compensation for the communities that have been affected. You mentioned being in Chibok and how that place was heavily militarized, and that's a reality that's for a lot of these rural areas in Borno State. But another stark opposite, which is just as devastating, is that in some areas they do not have any state authority. And some of the consequences of the lack of state of authority has presented itself is that people then have to rely on non-state actors for basic necessities like food, like healthcare. So to respond to your question now...
I'm afraid I would take that as your final word in the interest of time, because this is a very hard conversation to have and we cannot exhaust it all in 40 minutes. But thank you so very much. And I see that Dr. Nwokolo is there. I just want to ask you if you have 20 seconds for your final words, just to wrap up what you started saying, unfortunately.
Yeah, sorry, network was an issue. So I think one of the things to say here is that the Nigerian state, as well as all the states in the Lake Chad region, need to start rethinking outside the box, especially how to start providing post-conflict policing around the region. Because it's important to understand that it's up to the military to provide those kind of counter-insurgency activities, but up to the police to provide the security and as well support the rule of law. So within this region, what we've seen is that, yes, the MJTF may have been trying, but we need to start readapting the mechanism around the region to be able to get the result we want. Right. Especially understanding that insurgency is not something that is sorted out in a day. It's going to be a long process. For you to walk this long process, you need a lot of strategy. You need a lot of route. You need a lot of partners.
All right,
so
Dr.
finally,
yes, finally.
Finally, is to say that we need to start rebuilding the social cohesion in that region, and that is one thing that will help, especially with the civil society in that region. Thank you.
All right, thank you so very much, Dr. Nwokolo, and of course, Hawa and Ndubuisi, Chris, and Paul, and Saratu. Our audience, we apologize profusely. We would not open this conversation to you unless you want to give us 30 seconds? No? Yes?
Maybe 5 minutes.
5 minutes? That's so generous of you.
Okay.
Okay.
5 minutes so we can, because hands are already up. So.
Okay, thank you so very much. Yes. I'd like to begin with yes. We will just identify by eye contact. Yes, he.
And also help us by going straight to your question.
Yes. And number 2, number 3, and number 4.
Okay, thank you. My question
4 persons, 30 seconds. Please go ahead.
My question goes to Chris. I want to touch on kinetic and non-kinetic approaches, policy approaches. Like, what do you do in case of, you said you have recorded some sources when it comes to helping the military to boil down this thing. So what is your effort? What sources have you achieved, especially in policies like Borno model, and how it relates to forceful marriage, as they have said, about girls who are now women, who cannot go back to their family? Any sources around that?
Thank you. Number 2, your question, please. We'll take all the questions and then allow the...
Thank you. My name is Abdul Muttalib Ado Abakar, and I teach the University of Maiduguri. And mine is not actually a question, just some few additions. I like the panelists and the contribution they have made, particularly the issue of lack of information about Lake Chad region. It's very fundamental, because that region, there is political interest, which we are not very much clear about interest in the area. For example, we have the Chad, we have Niger, we have Cameroon, we have Nigeria. Each one of them has its own national interest. Then we also talked about the mineral deposits in that region, which is very central what are the mineral deposits in that? We are not fully actually informed about that. And we also understand that there are a lot of insurgents, not only Boko Haram,
of course,
in that area. How much do we know about it?
How much do we know about it? Thank you very much. I'll ask you to
briefly,
pass to the next person.
Just briefly. Please.
We'll have to move on.
I just want to say one thing.
I recognize that you want to say one thing, but thank you very much. So many others have one thing to say, but thank you so very much. We're grateful.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
If we are talking about security in Nigeria, we know it's a universal issue. It's not only in the northeast. So we have the north central, Zamfara, Kebbi. My point is, in Africa generally, there's a problem of leadership. And we bring it down to Nigeria. How intentional is the people in the government? Okay, Ms. Awa highlighted fundamental issues. My point is, how intentional is people in the government fighting security? Like you mentioned Lake Chad, I know the former president, Muhammadu Buhari, was at the UN summit, and he emphasized on the fact that Lake Chad is getting dry. What is the UN community doing? Security is not what only Nigeria can dive in. And so I mentioned the issue of the lady that passed away, this Tolulokpe Arotile. A very sad issue. This is a woman that's at the forefront fighting insurgents. I think the issue just went or swept under the carpet. This man that passed away, how will we call it, this Lagbaja. What are the issues? Is it that Nigeria itself does not want to fight the security? What is the international community doing to help Nigeria intentionally about security?
These issues. All right, please. It's the guy on pink, and that's the last person. Thank you so very much.
Yes.
Doctor, I apologize, but we'll give him time. Thank you.
Yes, good morning, everyone. My name is Jude Milia Moses, University of Maiduguri. The government wants the media. The insurgents also wants the media. So in order not to be branded as a terrorist media, and in order not the terrorists to see you as a supporter of the government, how do you balance trust? HumAngle are very good when it comes to exclusive. How do you balance trust? Government and insurgents. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that brilliant question. So how do you want to just start responding?
Okay, of course we have a responsibility to put our trust in our democratic system. And so, of course, it could be problematic if people from non-state actors think, oh, well, you're not being impartial in your reportage and all of that. But one way that we have used is to ensure to not platform a lot of their voices. It ties back to the first point I raised, which is about focusing on the victims rather than perpetrators. Again, of course, sometimes integrity demands that you actually feature those perpetrators' voices sometimes, and in those instances we do that. But you're right that, you know, we operate in a country that is not especially kind to journalists, and if you're a conflicts reporter, that also puts you at risk because insurgents also do not really like you to, for example, even call them insurgents. They take offense at being called terrorists. True. So they say if you want to call them terrorists, then you should call them Nigerian military terrorists as well. They believe they have a constituted authority to exist. They believe they are a military for their group, and so they shouldn't even be called terrorists. But of course, you have to call them what they are. I'm not sure if this helps, but focusing on the victim just helps to, you know, ensure that you're as neutral as possible.
Right. There was also another question on kinetic and non-kinetic use. I think it's the question from the young man there. Yes. So any of the panelists can take that. Chris, do you want to? Or Saratu?
There really isn't a lot of time. I think he asked specifically about the Borno model. Borno model is one of two major DDR, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration programs. The Borno model, I would say, at the onset, is what we would consider tentatively to be a success. It can be improved, it can be made better, but the commitments that the state governments have made have allowed us see an influx of combatants that have come in. The question you asked, I think, had to do with the forced marriages or the marriages between the combatants and, and the women they come with, right? Good. Now, so when they are received, there's a screening process where those women are assessed, where they are evaluated. And really, we leave it to their consent. As far as I know, it is based on their own consent. Children, those that are underage, those that are minors, are separated from that bunch. So as I said, there isn't a lot of time to get into the nitty-gritty of this program. Tentatively, it is a success. It can be improved, it can be refined, and it can be made better. But it's a positive thing. It's a positive initiative that the Borno State government has embarked on.
Thank you very much. Paul, you want to respond to the other question?
Just to add, in terms of reaction of what my brother say, I would say something who will surprise you is that when journalists went to the field, come back and issue their article, people was very surprised to know that there are some conflicts and some armed groups around the Lake Chad, and sometimes armed groups come from Chad to attack people in Nigeria and so on. So people are not even aware about what is happening there. They just know that there is a lake there, and it is enough for them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Paul. And then Saratu, the last question on political will.
I will respond to the last question from the lady there who was asking what is the Nigerian government doing and how intentional are we to fighting the insurgency. To be honest with you, the Nigerian government has really tried, and they have collaborated with both regional and international stakeholders to help in fighting the insurgency. But then the bottom line lies with what are we doing in-house? Because there's so much help you can get from outside. What are you doing inside? One of the things I can tell you is, and this is practical example of what we've done with communities where we work, we have found a way to empower the communities. Yes, there are risks involved, especially when you begin to reach out to security forces with information that could keep you safe. However, you need to stand up for yourself and then begin to call even the security forces, the government, and hold them accountable. So for me, this boils down to, yes, there is one angle where the government is doing everything, but there's so much the government can't do. We need to look inside. I believe that people are the agents of their own protection. Protection starts with every human being in this room. And unless you decide that I want to do something to protect myself, my community, my family, otherwise you do that and you're actively taking part in making some of these decisions that revolves around our protection as a people, there is so much the government can do, really.
Thank you so very, very much. This has been a very interesting session. I believe that CJID would agree with me that the time is not enough, and there's still so much to talk about. There's so much to dig in: information, capacity building, access, even understanding the whole conversation around countering insurgency in the Lake Chad Basin and in the Sahel region. Is so much that we need to do, but I really want to say thank you immensely to this panelist. You've done justice in spite of the very short time that we have. I know you have so many things you want to say more, but we don't have the time. So thank you so very much, Hawa, for the incredible work you're doing at HumAngle, and of course your contribution, and to Chris as well. Thank you for your contribution, and to Paul, thank you for bringing also that regional perspective to this whole conversation and bringing real life experiences of your colleagues and journalists and the work that you do. And of course, Saratu, who always meets the people first and engage with both military victims and civilians. And we do have Dr. Nwokolo, thank you. We are grateful that you shared your time also with us. Would like to have this conversation, but I believe we'll progress it and we continue to engage online. Thank you so very much, all of you, a great audience as well, and thank you for the generosity of time. And that's how we would wrap it, and I say good afternoon to you all.
All right, a round of applause, please, for this beautiful panel. Thank you, Amaka, Okoye, as well, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Please, if you please stand for photographs. Thank you very much.